Episode 10. The Roman Trial. Mark and Matthew. The Gospel writers seem agreed that there was a dawn meeting of the high priest's privy council at a second location. There they resolved to hand Jesus over to the Roman governor for capital punishment. For obvious reasons, they do not say that he claims to be Messiah. Rather, in language whose threat a Roman governor will understand, they charge him with claiming to be King of the Judeans. In Mark's Gospel, the action proceeds swiftly, without any scene setting. Pilate asks Jesus, "Are you King of the Judeans?" And he replies, "It is you who say so." The chief priests pile on accusations, and once again we witness the silence of Jesus and the amazement of Pilate, both hinting again at that fourth servant song of Isaiah 53. He never opened his mouth. Many peoples will be astonished on seeing him. The next scene, reported in all four Gospels, has Pilate try to release Jesus before taking a formal decision. According to a passing remark of Mark, he recognizes that the chief priests have handed him over because of a local grudge. Since he has the practice of releasing a prisoner each year at the behest of the Jerusalem crowds, he uses this as a way of avoiding taking a decision himself. To find in favor of Jesus would be to risk malicious reports of sedition going back to Rome. If he leaves it to the crowd, he will get the desired result without directly challenging the chief priests. After all, he relies on their collaboration. However, the strategy backfires. According to Mark, the chief priests stir up the crowd to demand the release of Barabbas. Mark has already introduced Barabbas as a prisoner awaiting trial among the rioters or rebels who had committed murder in the course of a riot. Pilate then asks the loaded and ambiguous question, "What do you want me to do with the King of the Judeans?" Now here's a question. Do the crowd shout, "Crucify him," or do they shout, "Crucify him"? Or perhaps we can hear the emphasis shifting as Pilate tries to plead with them. What crime has he committed? Until eventually Pilate is forced to follow his own logic and please the crowd. He releases Barabbas and hands Jesus over for the brutal scourging preliminary to death by crucifixion, the savage, exemplary death reserved for those who challenge the empire. Now, many commentators find problems with this scene. Pilate, who elsewhere in the history record appears ruthlessly pragmatic, seems uncharacteristically concerned for this unknown prisoner. Why would he give a second thought about crucifying a potential rebel, duly presented by his relatively trusted collaborators in Jerusalem? Then there's the oddness of the scene itself. There is nothing in the Jewish record to suggest that there was a local practice of releasing prisoners at the Passover that was taken on and respected by the Romans. Nor is there any suggestion in the Roman record of a similar practice either in Judea or elsewhere in the empire. As a result, some have suggested that the scene is an artificial creation, structured to absolve the Roman authorities of responsibility for Jesus' death, and to place that responsibility squarely on the shoulders of the Jerusalem crowd. We'll see that Matthew, Luke, and John do indeed go much further than Mark in emphasizing Pilate's reluctance. Matthew, in particular, adds dialogue that emphasizes the responsibility of the Jerusalemites, a dialogue that had terrible consequences for later Jewish-Christian relations. Thus, more radical interpreters have claimed to get below the surface of the gospel text to find a Jesus who is a genuinely revolutionary figure and a genuine threat to the empire. For them, the crucifixion simply is the direct response of Rome to a real threat of rebellion. Our scene is a later fiction created by second and third generation Christians to make Christianity acceptable to the empire and distance themselves from the Jews. Well, we always have to say, I don't know. But there are one or two things that suggest a more nuanced way of looking at the questions. John's Gospel in particular portrays Caiaphas as recognizing in Jesus a destabilizing presence. Since Pilate was only in Jerusalem to keep an eye on the festival, it seems reasonable to suppose that it was the Jewish authorities who had rounded up not only Jesus, but also the other prisoners now awaiting trial for rioting. And that was their job. The governor would then make a decision on his visit and order their punishment as appropriate. Given that Passover was a festival of liberation where religious and political aspirations could easily mix together in a heady cocktail, offering the crowds a choice of prisoner for release would not be a stupid strategy. On the one hand, the public condemnation and execution of the guilty sends an important annual message not to mess with Roman justice. On the other, the simultaneous release of a token prisoner chosen by public demand deflects some hostility and demonstrates the clemency of Roman rule. We might even suppose that a cynical practice would include a harmless extra among those arrested, so that no one genuinely dangerous would get released. Such a scenario is compatible with the four Gospel accounts, all of which, together with the oblique mention in Acts of the Apostles, insist on this scene. If this were a practice developed by Pilate ad hoc, the fact that it is not mentioned either in Josephus, the rabbinic tradition, or elsewhere in the empire would be no surprise. If there is an element of surprise, it is why the crowd would prefer the release of Barabbas to the innocent Jesus. Mark, as we saw, suggests that the chief priest's agents stirred them up. This is not implausible, and might have been rather easier than we think. We are used to accepting the gospel picture in which Jesus has a dramatic impact on the whole of Jerusalem during his last week there. However, the crowds were huge during Passover. Jesus' committed followers were not that numerous, and many of the local Jerusalem dwellers may not have been so ready to be impressed by a prophet from Galilee. What of those who had been tagging along, hoping for a Messiah and a revolution? Jesus was publicly asked about paying taxes to Caesar, the question that had inspired a regional uprising 30 years before. His answer was, "Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." If you had been hoping for a new age free from Roman control, would you still be looking to Jesus to bring it about? Barabbas, on the other hand, arrested with others for rioting against the Rome-compliant authorities. Who would you choose on the day? The last 5 minutes has been entirely speculative, but it shows one possible way of making sense of some of the basic elements of a narrative strand on which all the Gospels insist. And it sets us free to consider some of the dynamics that the Gospel writers are playing with in their different versions of the scene. One thing we might ask when we look at Mark's account is whether it does actually put the Romans in a better light. Pilate tries to wriggle out of a difficult decision by appealing to the crowd, and when that goes wrong, he shrugs his shoulders and gives them what they want. Is this really the representative of the might of empire? Mark's account lays bare the fragility and compromise of this imperial rule. In the midst of this injustice stands the truly just one. Jesus Christ, the Son of God announced at the beginning of the Gospel, is condemned by the representative of Tiberius, Son of God, not out of justice, not even out of malice, but out of powerlessness. And Mark's next scene hardly shows Roman rule in a better light. We do not see Jesus being scourged, but we do see him being dressed up, beaten, and mocked by the soldiers in the Roman enclave. The raw exercise of imperial power by its lesser agents as gratuitous cruelty. The infliction of needless pain for the malign pleasure of showing a subjected people that they are subjects. We have seen it in our own time in the stories from Abu Ghraib. The symbols are powerful. The imperial purple and the crown of thorns, mockery and torture at the same time. A king that is no king of a despised subject race. And yet for the Christian reader, the scene is laden with dramatic irony. For all that the image is distorted through the cruelty and contempt of the soldiers, they really are kneeling before the Messiah, the King of the Jews. Mark is most likely writing before the resolution of the rebellion against the Romans. Subtle resistance is still thinkable. The terrible persecution of Christians in Rome, recorded by the Roman historian Tacitus, is still a vivid memory. We've seen throughout that Mark's Gospel has a dramatic focus on the sufferings of Christ, and constantly invites the disciples within and outside the text to identify with him in their own trials and tribulations. Mark forces the reader to look at the violence and brutality which are a present reality in the Christian experience of empire, and see their true king revealed in the midst of it. There is solidarity in suffering, and the promise of vindication, the final triumph over the oppressive forces of the supernatural enemy made visible in the faces of the soldiers. Matthew, Luke, and John were writing in a very different era. After the revolt of 66 was finally crushed in 70, both Jews and Christians had work to do to prove that they are not a threat to empire. How does this affect their accounts? We'll begin with Matthew, who follows Mark most closely. After the chief priests and elders take Jesus to Pilate, Matthew adds an extra scene. We see Judas repenting for what he has done once he sees that Jesus has been condemned. It is almost as if he didn't expect that to happen. He has betrayed innocent blood. He returns the 30 pieces of silver to the elders and chief priests, and then goes and hangs himself. After deliberation, they resolve to purchase a plot on the potter's field to provide graves for foreigners. Luke's version of the death of Judas in Acts of the Apostles is very different. There it is Judas who buys an unnamed field and there collapses, his entrails bursting. Rather than remorse and repentance, we see divine retribution. Matthew uses his version of the narrative in two ways. First, the land can be identified. Even today, it is known as the Field of Blood. Thus, for Matthew, writing with an eye to a skeptical readership, we have an important piece of evidential proof supporting the narrative. But side by side with that, we see another related concern of Matthew's, a scriptural proof. This event fulfills a prophecy of Jeremiah. However, what Matthew presents as quotation from Jeremiah is actually a complex interweaving of Tanakh text, rich in suggestive theological narratives. The 30 pieces of silver are the price paid to assuage a blood guilt in Exodus, or the price paid to Zechariah for his prophecy of divine judgment. And Zechariah was believed to have been murdered for his pains. In Jeremiah, the potter provides a living symbol of how God works with God's people, constantly reshaping them and starting again. But Jeremiah also buys a plot of land as a sign that the people of God will have a future on their land, in spite of the occupation by Babylon. We then return to the main action and see Jesus standing before the governor. Matthew perhaps wants to demonstrate respect for the Roman authority, rather than simply naming him Pilate as Mark does. In all, he refers to him 5 times as the governor and 4 times by name. The dialogue then unfolds much as in Mark, though, as ever in Matthew, in slightly more elaborate Greek and with more dialogue. Matthew's Pilate addresses the gathered crowd and asks them who they want released, Barabbas or Jesus, called the Anointed One. Matthew, as a Jewish Christian writing after 70 AD, carefully chooses not to mention rebellion or rioting. Barabbas is simply a notorious prisoner. When Pilate initially addresses the crowd, he uses Jesus' Jewish title, Anointed One, rather than the more secular King of the Jews. Perhaps this underlines that Pilate sees the issue as a local grudge. He doesn't immediately present Jesus to the crowd as a direct challenger to Roman rule. Or perhaps Matthew simply finds it implausible that Pilate would offer to release for the crowd anyone who had claimed to be their king. Matthew then adds a further element to underline his understanding of Pilate's motivation. Pilate's wife sends him a note. She has had a dream and warns him to have nothing to do with that just man. Simple phrases are powerfully laden in our very dense texts, and here we glimpse the narrative thread of the suffering just man. That thread runs all the way through the scriptures, from the story of Abel through Isaiah's suffering servant to the figure of the persecuted virtuous man in wisdom. Let us lie in wait for the virtuous man, since he annoys us. The just man suffers, but will be vindicated by God. Pilate asks whom he should release, and the crowd calls for Barabbas, persuaded by the chief priests and elders. When asked what to do with Jesus, called the Anointed One, they answer, "Let him be crucified." Matthew expands on Mark's bare narrative. The crowd is becoming louder and more violent. Pilate's question, what crime has he committed, only makes things worse. It is no use, he can do nothing. Matthew now expands on Mark's simple, and he gave them what they wanted. In a very significant and consequential addition to Mark's account, he has Pilate wash his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this blood. You shall witness." Matthew's Pilate absolves the Roman authorities of any responsibility for Jesus' death. The response comes back no longer from a crowd, but from the people. That theological word implying the people of God. Their words, "His blood be upon us and on our children." In context, we can best read Matthew as doing something similar to Luke. That is to say, he is giving a respectably Jewish theological explanation for the disastrous end to the revolt in Judea and the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, a generation after the time of Jesus' trial. He is reading these events, like Luke, within the theological matrix of the book of Deuteronomy, as delayed punishment for disobedience, in this case, for the rejection of the Messiah. But these lines have been misread by Christians of later centuries with terrible consequences. They are at the root of the terrible slur that the whole Jewish people in every age is responsible for the death of the Son of God. It is only in the last 80 years, after the horrors of the Holocaust and the development of a richer theology of interfaith relations, that the Catholic Church has been able definitively to reject such misinterpretation and eradicate it from liturgical text. Although Matthew thus exonerates Pilate of guilt and places the burden of blame on the people of Jerusalem, he too hints at Pilate's weakness. The governor was supposed to stand up for Roman justice, to protect the just man, but he found himself helpless before the baying crowd. And Matthew makes the point that it is the governor's own soldiers who take Jesus and mock him, as described by Mark. Whatever Pilate may have thought about Jesus as a just man, it is his men who kneel before him, mocking the King of the Jews, crowned with thorns and dressed in scarlet. And it is his men who will drag him off to execution.